I took the job because no one else wanted it. That should have been enough to walk away. The listing barely explained anything, just a title, a start date, and an address that didn't even load properly on my GPS. No company name, no details, just a quiet kind of invitation, waiting for someone desperate enough not to ask questions. And at that point in my life, that was me. I wasn't looking for something better. I was looking for something that would take me far enough away that nothing could follow. And for a while, I thought I found it. The town didn't feel wrong when I arrived. That's the part that still bothers me. It looked normal. A few houses, a diner, a gas station with flickering lights. But people noticed me. Not in a curious way. Not in a welcoming way. They noticed me the way you notice something out of place. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Conversations ended when I walked in. Eyes followed me just long enough to make it clear I had already been seen. And somehow, that felt worse than being ignored. Everything changed when the sun started to go down. Not slowly, not naturally. It was like the entire town was moving on a schedule I didn't understand. Lights went off, doors locked, curtains pulled shut all at once. No hesitation, no delay. Like everyone already knew exactly when it was time to disappear. That's when someone told me the rule. Calm voice, no emotion, no explanation. Stay inside after dark. Don't look outside. Don't answer if something calls you. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a town. I should have listened. I didn't. Because later that night, I heard something outside my window. Slow footsteps, barely there, but close enough to feel. Then a voice, low, familiar in a way that didn't make sense. Ethan. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to make sure I heard it. And as I stood there, staring at the curtain, I understood something I wish I hadn't. It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to get me to respond. And that was the moment. Everything changed. Before we go any further, I want you to pay attention to one thing. Stories like this aren't loud. They don't rely on jumps or shocks. They stay quiet. And that's exactly why they stay with you. If you're the kind of person who notices small details, who questions things that don't quite make sense, then you're going to understand this story in a way most people won't. Because sometimes the scariest part isn't what you see, it's what you almost notice. So, if that's the kind of story you're here for, make sure you subscribe. This channel is built around cases, accounts, and experiences that don't give you easy answers. Leave a like if you want more of this. It helps more than you think, and it tells me to keep going deeper into stories like this one. The ones that feel real, because they almost are. And before we continue, I want you to answer something honestly in the comments. If something called your name, in the middle of the night, from outside your window, would you ignore it? Or would you do what most people do and look anyway? My name is Ethan Cole, and I didn't take that job because it was a good opportunity. I took it because it asked nothing from me. No past, no explanation, no reason to stay longer than I wanted. At least, that's what I thought. The listing itself barely existed. A few lines of text, no company name, no details, just night maintenance, and an address that looked like it had been typed without checking if it actually led anywhere. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because I was unsure, but because something about it felt too easy. And in my experience, anything that feels that easy usually isn't. I just chose to ignore that feeling. The call came faster than expected. Less than an hour after I sent the message, my phone rang from a number with no caller ID. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself, didn't ask who I was. It just confirmed my name, told me when to arrive, and gave me the same address I had already seen. I tried to ask what exactly the job involved, and there was a pause. Not long, but deliberate. Then he said something that didn't sit right with me. "You'll understand when you get here. Not "we'll explain," not "you'll be trained," just that. And for some reason, I accepted it. I didn't pack much, just enough to leave quickly if I needed to. That thought stayed in the back of my mind the entire time I was driving. Not strong enough to stop me, but persistent enough to be noticed. The road out of the city was normal at first. Traffic, noise, movement. But the further I went, the more everything seemed to thin out. Fewer cars, longer stretches of empty road. Eventually, even the signs started disappearing. My GPS cut out twice before I realized it wasn't coming back. That should have been my second warning. But by then, I had already gone too far to turn around without thinking about it. The town appeared without transition. One moment, there was nothing. And then suddenly, there it was. Houses, a diner, a gas station, with one flickering light above the entrance. It didn't feel abandoned. That would have made more sense. It felt paused, like everything was in place, but nothing was actively happening. I slowed the car down as I drove through, expecting someone to look up, to react, to acknowledge that someone new had arrived. And they did, just not in the way I expected. No one waved, no one spoke. They just looked. And then they looked away. I parked near the center of town and sat there for a moment, engine still running, hands resting on the steering wheel. Something felt off, but not in a way I could explain. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was awareness. The kind you get when you walk into a place and realize you don't understand the rules, but everyone else does. And the worst part wasn't that I didn't know them. It was that no one seemed willing to explain them. And that's when I should have left. But instead, I stepped out of the car. The diner was exactly where the voice on the phone said it would be. Right at the corner, facing the only intersection that seemed to matter in that town. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Old sign, dim lights, curtains drawn halfway across the windows, like someone had tried to block the view without fully committing to it. But the moment I stepped inside, something shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to point out, just enough to feel it. Conversations didn't stop completely, but they lowered. Forks kept moving, cups were still lifted, but slower, controlled, like the room had adjusted to my presence in a way that felt practiced. And that was the first time I realized I wasn't unexpected. I was already anticipated. There were only a handful of people inside, but every single one of them knew I didn't belong there. A man at the counter eating in silence, never once looking up, but his grip on the fork tightened when I walked in. Two women in a booth speaking in whispers, their eyes fixed on the table until I moved closer, then briefly lifting just enough to confirm I was real. No one greeted me. No one asked anything. It wasn't avoidance. It was something else, like they were waiting for me to say something first, and hoping I wouldn't. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. Every few seconds, someone looked at it, You must be Ethan." The voice came from behind the counter, calm, flat, certain. I turned and saw her already watching me. Martha Doyle, late 50s, maybe older. Tired eyes, steady posture, the kind of expression that doesn't give anything away unless you're paying attention. She didn't ask if it was me. She already knew. Without breaking eye contact, she reached below the counter and placed a key in front of her. Old brass, worn edges, a small motel tag attached to it with the number 6 scratched into the surface instead of printed. "You're staying just outside town," she said. Not a question, not a suggestion, a statement. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You got here just in time." I didn't ask what she meant. Not right away. Instead, I sat down at the counter, more out of instinct than comfort. She poured coffee without asking and placed it in front of me, her hand lingering just slightly longer than necessary on the cup. I noticed then that she wasn't really looking at me anymore. Her eyes kept drifting toward the window behind me. Not openly, subtly, like she was checking something she didn't want me to notice. I followed her gaze once, but all I saw was the empty street outside and the fading light. When I turned back, she spoke again. "You shouldn't be outside after dark." There it was again. Not a suggestion, not advice, a rule. I gave a small laugh, the kind people use when something sounds more serious than it should. "Why?" I asked. Martha didn't answer right away. She picked up the same cloth she had been holding earlier and started wiping the counter in slow, repetitive motions. Too slow, too deliberate. Then she stopped, looked at me properly for the first time and said, "Don't look outside. Don't answer if something calls you, and whatever you do." She hesitated, not like she was thinking, like she was deciding how much she could say. "Don't open the door." I waited for her to explain. She didn't, and somehow that made it worse. The property sat just outside the town, exactly where Martha said it would be. Far enough to feel separate, close enough to still be part of whatever this place was. 6 units, all identical, lined up with unnatural precision. Same doors, same windows, same faded paint peeling in the exact same places, like they had all aged at the same time. No cars, no lights, no signs of recent activity. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt maintained, without being used. I stood there for a moment, key in my hand, noticing something I hadn't picked up on before. There were no sounds, not even the kind you stop noticing after a while. No wind, no insects, nothing. Inside, the room was clean. Too clean. Not recently cleaned, but preserved. The bed was perfectly made, corners sharp, untouched. The air smelled faintly of bleach, but not fresh. More like it had been used repeatedly to erase something that didn't stay gone for long. I placed my bag on the table and walked to the window. From there, I could see the edge of the town. Every house I could make out had its curtains closed, not partially, completely, and as I stood there watching, one more curtain shifted slightly, not opening, not closing, just adjusting. Like someone on the other side had noticed me looking. I stepped back from the window immediately. Not out of fear, not yet, but out of something closer to instinct. The same instinct that tells you when you've overstayed somewhere you weren't invited to begin with. That's when I heard it. A car approaching. Slow, controlled. I stepped outside just as a sheriff's vehicle came to a stop a few feet away from me. The engine stayed running. The headlights stayed on. After a moment, the door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-40s, solid posture, calm in a way that didn't feel natural, more like practiced control than personality. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, like he had been expecting me longer than I had been there. "You're new," he said, not a question. I told him I had just arrived. He nodded once, then glanced past me toward the row of identical units. His eyes lingered there for a second too long, not like he was checking something, but like he was listening for it. "Harper," he said, "Sheriff." I introduced myself, and for a brief moment, something changed in his expression. A small shift, almost unnoticeable, but enough to tell me that my name meant something here, or had before. "You settling in?" he asked. I said I was. He took one step closer, lowering his voice slightly. "This town works a certain way," he said. "People follow the routine, especially at night." Then, after a pause, "You already know the rules." I didn't answer, not because I agreed, but because it didn't feel like something I was supposed to respond to. Harper studied me for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward the road, his head tilting just enough to suggest he was listening again. The silence stretched between us, heavy, deliberate. Then he spoke without looking back at me. "If you hear something, don't go looking for it. A beat passed, and don't let it hear you respond." He walked back to his car, got in, and drove off without another word. I stood there watching until the sound of the engine disappeared completely. And that's when I noticed something that hadn't been true a moment ago. The sun hadn't fully set yet, but every single light in town was already off. But now I knew it wasn't just part of the architecture. It was part of a tradition. I went inside before the sun fully disappeared, not because I believed the rule, but because everything about the timing felt too precise to ignore. The moment I closed the door, the silence changed. Outside, it had felt distant. Inside, it felt contained, like the room itself was part of the rule. I locked the door without thinking, then checked it again a few seconds later, just to be sure. The window sat across from the bed, covered by a thin curtain that moved slightly, even though there was no air coming in. I turned on the television, hoping for noise, something normal. But all I got was static. No channels, no signal. Just a low, constant hiss that made the room feel even more isolated. That's when I realized I wasn't just alone. I was cut off. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. At first, there was nothing. But after a few minutes, I started to notice something I hadn't expected. The silence wasn't empty. It had layers. Beneath it, there were small sounds. Subtle, inconsistent. A faint dragging noise somewhere in the distance. A shift, like something moving just outside of where it should be. Once, I was sure I heard footsteps. Slow, uneven, stopping the moment I focused on them. Like whatever it was didn't want to be confirmed. I held my breath without realizing it, listening harder, trying to separate real sounds from imagined ones. But the more I listened, the less certain I became. Then the voice came, not suddenly, gradually, like it had always been there, just out of reach until that moment. At first, it was too low to understand, just a tone, something human enough to recognize, but distant enough to question. Then it came again, closer, clearer. Ethan! I froze. Completely. Every part of me went still. No one here should have known my name like that. Not with that tone. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, familiar, like someone who had been saying it for a long time. And then it came again, right outside the door. I stood up before I realized I had made the decision to move. Every instinct I had told me to stay where I was, to ignore it, to let it pass. But it didn't feel like curiosity anymore. It felt like something pulling me forward, step by step. The floor didn't creak. The air didn't move. Even my breathing felt too loud. Ethan. Closer now. Softer. Waiting. I stopped a few feet from the door, my hand hovering just above the handle. And that's when Martha's words came back to me. Don't look. Don't answer. Don't open the door. For a second, I actually listened. Then I moved toward the window instead. Slower. Careful. Like I was trying not to let it know what I had decided. The curtain was still there, thin enough to see shapes through, but not details. I reached out and pulled it back just slightly. There was something standing in the road, barefoot, perfectly still, facing my window. But something about it wasn't right. The proportions felt off. The stillness felt forced, like it was trying too hard to look human. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was looking directly at me. Not searching, not guessing, knowing. And then, without warning, every light outside turned on at once. Bright, sudden, blinding. I flinched, instinctively pulling back. And when I looked again, the road was empty. But the feeling didn't leave, because I knew something now. It didn't just find me. It knew I responded. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I stayed sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the curtain, waiting for it to move again. The room didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't just small. It felt occupied, like something had been there and hadn't fully left. Every sound I thought I heard made me stop breathing for a second, listening, trying to understand if it was outside or closer than that. But the voice never came back. And somehow that made it worse, because silence like that doesn't feel empty. It feels finished, like whatever needed to happen already did. Morning didn't arrive naturally. It didn't slowly replace the dark. It cut through it. One moment, the room was still covered in shadows, and the next, everything turned grey at once. I stood up immediately and pulled the curtain open, not hesitating this time. The road was empty. No footprints, no marks, no sign that anything had been there. For a second, I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. That exhaustion, isolation, and a place like this had pushed my mind further than it should go. But then I stepped outside and saw the ground. Right in front of my door, the dirt had been disturbed. Not like footsteps, not like someone walking back and forth. It was a single area, pressed down, like something had stood there for a long time without moving. Too long. I stared at it, trying to understand what could leave a mark like that without shifting even slightly. And then I noticed something else. The position. It wasn't random. It was directly in front of the door. Not the window. The door, like it had been waiting for me to open it. I went back to the diner. Not because I needed answers, but because I needed to see if anyone would acknowledge what happened. Martha was already there, exactly where she had been before, moving the same way, doing the same things. When she saw me, she didn't look surprised. She didn't ask how my night was. She just watched me sit down, her eyes drifting for a brief second toward the door behind me, before returning to my face. "You heard it," she said. Not a question. I didn't answer. She nodded slowly, then quietly. "It knows you now." I found Sheriff Harper later that morning, standing at the edge of town like he had been there for hours. When I told him what happened, he didn't react. Not surprise, not concern. Just a long pause, followed by a slow breath. "You weren't supposed to look," he said. I asked him what it was. He didn't answer. I asked him what happens now. This time, he looked at me, really looked at me. "You stay," he said. Not a threat, not a warning, a fact. I tried to leave that afternoon, packed everything, drove out the same road I came in, 10 minutes, 20. Then I saw it again. The diner, the same corner, the same sign. I hadn't turned. I tried again, same result. That's when I stopped asking what this place is and started understanding what it does. Because once it calls your name, you don't leave. You become part of what's already here. There are places like this, not abandoned, not hidden, just unspoken. Places that exist quietly, just outside the patterns people trust. You don't hear about them because no one leaves with a story they can explain. And if they do, it never sounds right. Details don't match. Timelines don't make sense. Because places like this don't just exist physically. They operate differently. They learn the people who arrive, and they adjust. The people there aren't trapped the way you'd expect. They move, they talk, they go through the same routines every day. But every action is controlled by something they no longer question. Not fear, not anymore. Something closer to understanding. Because once you hear it, once it says your name, the rules stop feeling like rules. They feel necessary. You don't look outside. You don't answer. You don't open the door. Not because someone told you, but because you already know what happens if you do. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not what it is, not what it looks like, but the idea that something can be just outside your window, close enough to know your name, close enough to wait for you to respond. Because the truth is, it doesn't need to force anything. It just waits. And eventually, everyone responds. So if you ever find yourself somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere quiet in a way that doesn't feel natural, pay attention to how people behave after dark. Watch the windows, watch the doors. And if no one is outside, there's usually a reason. And if something calls your name, don't answer, don't look, just stay inside. Because once you do, it won't call your name again. It won't need to.